Picture this. It is September 1778. You are trapped inside a small wooden fort in the middle of the Kentucky wilderness. There is no U.S. Army coming to save you. There is no radio. There is no way to call for help. There is no backup plan. There is nothing between you and the wilderness outside except a few logs hammered together and the people standing next to you. Outside those walls, over 400 warriors, Shawnee, Cherokee, and French-Canadian fighters, fully armed, fully prepared, and absolutely furious. They have cannons. They have rifles. They have numbers on their side that make the math look completely impossible. And they have one single mission: tear this fort to the ground, wipe out everything inside it, and drive every last settler out of Kentucky forever. Inside the fort, less than 60 able-bodied men, women, children, dwindling food, gunpowder running low, walls with gaps in them, and one man, exhausted, recently escaped from enemy captivity, with people inside his own fort who thought he might be a traitor, holding the whole thing together with nothing but guts, cleverness, and a will that simply refused to break. That man was Daniel Boone. Now you have probably heard that name before. Maybe you picture a guy in a coonskin cap wandering around the woods like some kind of mythical superhero who never missed a shot and never lost a fight. Hollywood loved that version of him. But here is the truth. The real Daniel Boone was something far more interesting than any legend. Because legends do not sweat. Legends do not grieve. Real people do that. And Daniel Boone was a real person. Boone was born on November 2nd, 1734, in Berks County, Pennsylvania. His parents were Quakers, peaceful and deeply religious people. Daniel was the sixth of 11 children. Growing up right at the edge of the frontier, his neighbors included the Lenape Indians. And here is a detail most telling: skip right over. Boone learned how to hunt from the Lenape. He did not see them as enemies. He learned from them. And that relationship quietly shaped everything he would become. By 12, he had his first rifle. By 13, he was the one regularly putting food on the family table. He never stepped inside a school a single day in his life. Family members taught him to read and write. His two favorite books were the Bible and Gulliver's Travels, one about faith and survival, one about a man thrown into impossible situations in worlds he did not understand. Boone built every skill he had from the ground up, through experience, through failure, through getting back up. By the 1760s, word had reached Boone about Kentucky. Land stretching as far as you could see, rivers full of fish, woods full of deer, buffalo, bear, and turkey. For a man like Boone, a hunter, a trapper, someone who measured wealth in open land and wild places, Kentucky sounded like everything he had ever wanted. There was just one enormous problem. Kentucky was not empty land. Kentucky was not empty land. It was a critically important hunting ground for multiple tribes: the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Mingo, and others, people who had lived in and around that territory for generations. They used it. They depended on it. They had fought for it. The Shawnee and the other tribes were not attacking settlers out of cruelty. They were defending their home. And they had already made their position on outsiders extremely clear, more than once. In 1769, Boone pushed through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. The Shawnee caught him twice on that trip. The first time, they took everything he had, all his skins, all his supplies, let him go, and warned him in no uncertain terms never to come back. He came back. Most people, after being captured twice by the same group who told them to leave, would take that as a fairly clear message. Boone heard the message. He just did not stop. By 1773, Boone tried to move his entire family and a group of about 50 settlers through that same gap to build a permanent settlement. A combined group of Lenape, Shawnee, and Cherokee fighters attacked the party. 6 people were killed, including Boone's oldest son, James, who was only 16 years old. That loss, losing his son on the edge of the frontier he had pushed them all toward, would have permanently broken most people. Boone grieved, but he did not walk away. Within 2 years, Boone was back. This time cutting a trail that would become the famous Wilderness Road, the main artery through which tens of thousands of settlers would eventually pour into Kentucky, and founding a settlement right in the heart of the most contested land on the continent. He called it Boonesborough. And that decision, that stubborn, costly, consequential decision, set every single thing that followed directly into motion. The man at the center of the Shawnee's military effort was a warrior and leader named Blackfish. He was not simply a fighter. He was a strategist, a commander, and a leader who carried real grief alongside his mission. He had lost an adopted son, killed in earlier fighting with settlers, and that loss was personal fuel for everything that followed. He was fighting for land, for people, for a way of life that he could see slipping away. Remember that name, Blackfish. Instead of executing Boone, Blackfish was so genuinely impressed by him that the tribe adopted Boone as a member of the Shawnee. They gave him a name, Sheltawi. Big Turtle. He was welcomed into a Shawnee family, ate with them, hunted with them, lived alongside them for 4 months. 4 months. Boone was living inside the community of the very people who were planning to destroy his settlement. And the entire time, he was watching, listening, learning that Blackfish was organizing something massive. So Boone escaped. He ran approximately 160 miles through wilderness in 4 days. No road, no trail, just forest, rivers, and whatever he could find to eat along the way. When he finally pushed through the gate of Boonesborough, barely standing, half-starved, running on fumes, the people inside barely recognized him. And the first thing he did after catching his breath was start preparing that fort for the hardest fight of its life. Boonesborough was not a military fortress. It was a rough collection of log walls, a few blockhouses at the corners, and a cluster of cabins inside a perimeter never designed to absorb a sustained military assault. Sections of the wall had gaps. The internal well was unreliable, a critical weakness, because if you cannot access water during a siege, you lose regardless of how well you fight. Supplies were not where they needed to be, and the people inside were tired in the deep way that wears through a person's judgment and patience. Some of the settlers inside Boonesborough did not trust him. Boone had spent 4 months living with the Shawnee. To a frightened settler who had watched friends get killed in raids, that biography looked deeply suspicious. There were people inside that fort, people Boone was trying to keep alive, who quietly believed he might have switched sides. Think about what it takes to lead under that condition. He did not waste time defending himself. He got to work. Boone organized repair teams to patch the weakest sections of the wall. He sent scouts out to gather intelligence. He reached out to nearby settlements for reinforcements. He rationed what food and powder they had. He kept people moving, kept them busy, kept their hands doing something useful because idle hands in a frightened fort are the fastest path to panic. Real leadership in a crisis is not always dramatic speeches. Most of the time it looks exactly like this, unglamorous, grinding work that keeps a fragile situation from falling apart. On September 7, 1778, Boone was at the walls when the scouts came back with confirmation. Then he saw it himself, movement in the tree line. The disciplined, unmistakable movement of a large force taking up positions. Warriors spreading out along the perimeter of the fort, covering every angle, cutting off every direction of retreat or escape. Hundreds of fighters, surrounding a wooden fort held by 60. The siege of Boonesborough had begun. When Blackfish arrived at Boonesborough, he did not immediately start shooting. He sent a message to the fort saying he had come to take the settlers peacefully to Detroit, where they would be placed under British protection. No bloodshed required. Just surrender, gather your things, and walk out. It was a reasonable offer by the military logic of the time. Blackfish had the numbers, the supplies, and the patience. He could simply wait. Boone started negotiating. He stalled. He told Blackfish they needed time to consider the offer. He stretched those conversations out over days, treating the negotiation as if surrender was genuinely on the table. Every hour he kept those talks going was an hour his people spent reinforcing the walls. Every day of negotiation was another day for possible reinforcements to close the distance. It was not cowardice. It was one of the most tactically intelligent moves of his entire life. At one point during those negotiations, Boone did something that takes a particular kind of nerve to even consider. He walked outside the fort. He stepped through the gate, away from the walls and the rifles of his own people, and sat down face to face with Blackfish and his commanders in the open ground between the two forces. No walls around him. No cover. Nothing between him and the army that had come to take everything he had built. The negotiations lasted 2 full days. Eventually the talking stopped. Whatever the specific trigger, the result was immediate and unmistakable. Boone and his men ran. They sprinted back toward the fort gate with Shawnee warriors right behind them. Boone was grabbed, held briefly, and broke free. He made it through the gate. And then the gate slammed shut and the world outside erupted. The Shawnee opened fire from multiple positions simultaneously. The siege of Boonesborough had truly begun. The Shawnee opened fire from multiple positions simultaneously. The French Canadians set up a cannon and started firing. Warriors attempted to rush the walls at multiple points. The noise alone must have been terrifying: gunfire, shouting, wood splintering, smoke filling the air inside those cramped cabins. And in the middle of all of it, Boone, moving along the walls, directing fire, keeping people calm, making split-second decisions about where the next threat was coming from. 60 people against 400. And somehow the walls held. Between major assaults there were stretches of tense, exhausting silence. Men trying to sleep in short rotations while others kept watch. Children pressed against walls. Food rationed in amounts that left everyone perpetually hungry. The Shawnee were running a sophisticated psychological operation, calling out to specific settlers by name in the darkness. Making noise through the night to prevent sleep. Projecting patience and size. It was calculated, and it was working, slowly, on people who were already stretched thin. The women inside Boonesborough did not sit in corners waiting for the outcome. They molded bullets continuously, feeding the ammunition supply the men on the walls were burning through. They loaded rifles and passed them forward so the rate of fire never had to slow down. They carried water. They managed the children, the food supply, the interior logistics of a fort under sustained attack. Without that contribution, Boonesborough falls. It is that simple, and it should be said that directly. With only 60 fighters, stationary positions would have made the thinness of the garrison obvious. So Boone kept people moving, rotating defenders continuously along the walls, appearing at different positions, creating the visual impression that the fort held significantly more people than it actually did. 60 people doing the work of presenting themselves as a much larger force, hour after hour, day after day. 60 people pretending to be 300. And it was working. The Shawnee shifted tactics. They started digging, a tunnel aimed at the foundation of the fort walls, designed to collapse the structure from below. If that tunnel reached the walls, the defense ended. But the settlers noticed the displaced soil and identified the direction of the tunnel. They began digging a counter-trench from inside the fort to intercept it. Two forces, separated by a wooden wall, digging toward each other in the dark while a gunfight continued above their heads. By the 10th day, the settlers were running on almost nothing. Sleep deprivation had accumulated into a fog settling over every decision. Food was critically short. Gunpowder reserves were a serious concern. The walls had been patched and repatched. People were injured. People were exhausted in the way that goes beyond the body and starts eating at something deeper. And Blackfish, who had maintained the siege with remarkable discipline and patience, made his final calculation. On the night of September 17, 1778, the 10th day of the siege, Blackfish committed everything. The Shawnee launched a full assault on the fort from all sides simultaneously. Sustained rifle fire from multiple directions. The cannon firing repeatedly. Warriors attempting to breach the walls. Fire arrows launched onto the rooftops of the cabins inside, because if the buildings inside caught fire, the whole fort would burn down with everyone inside it. And the rooftops did start burning. This is the moment where everything could have collapsed, because now the settlers were fighting a two-front battle, defending the walls from the attack outside while simultaneously putting out fires inside. People running in the dark. Smoke everywhere. Gunfire mixing with the sound of crackling wood. Children screaming. People desperately pouring water on burning rooftops while others fired rifles into the darkness outside. It was absolute chaos. And Boone was everywhere, moving through the smoke, directing people, refusing to let anyone freeze up. Boone's arm had been grazed by a bullet earlier in the siege. He kept moving. Here is the thing about leadership under pressure: it is not about being fearless. Fear is normal. Fear is human. What Boone had was the ability to act clearly despite the fear, to think 2 steps ahead while everything around him was on fire. Literally. And when the person in charge refuses to stop, the people around them find something in themselves they did not know was there. By some combination of exhaustion, strategic repositioning, and rain, the weather actually helped put out some of the fires. The final assault began to weaken. The firing slowed. And then on the morning of September 18, 1778, the 11th day, the settlers at Boonesborough looked out from the walls and saw something they had barely dared to hope for. The Shawnee were gone. Blackfish had called off the siege and led his forces back north. Nobody inside that fort died during the actual siege itself. 9 men had been killed in earlier skirmishes leading up to the event, but through 11 days of direct siege warfare, not a single defender inside Boonesborough was killed. 60 people, 11 days, 400 warriors. They held. Boone sat down against the wall of that fort, exhausted beyond words, and looked at the empty tree line. They had actually done it. The siege of Boonesborough broke the momentum of the tribal campaign to drive settlers out of Kentucky. After the siege failed, the united military effort never again reached the same scale. Settlements in Kentucky survived and grew. But here is the part that sits uncomfortably: it meant the tribes lost. Not just this battle, but eventually, their land. What was a victory for Boone's people was the beginning of the end for theirs. History is not always clean. Real events have real consequences that go in multiple directions. Daniel Boone never got rich. He lost his land. He lost family members. He outlived his wife and many of his friends. By most material measures, his life was full of loss. But what he left behind was something else entirely. He proved that ordinary people, in impossible situations, with the right mindset and the refusal to quit, can do extraordinary things. Not because they are superheroes. Not because the odds were in their favor, but because they refused to stop. The siege of Boonesborough is one of the most remarkable stories in American history. A man who learned survival from the very people he would one day fight. Who lost his son on the frontier he refused to abandon. Who lived among his enemy and walked back out to defend his people. Who led 60 people through 11 days of siege against 400 warriors and lost not a single life inside those walls. That is not mythology. That is what actually happened. Boone understood better than most the full complexity of what he was part of. He had lived among the Shawnee. He knew exactly who he was fighting, and who he was defending. He knew that Blackfish was not a monster, that the land being contested had belonged to someone before the settlers arrived, and that the consequences of what happened at Boonesborough would ripple outward in directions that could not be controlled. He kept going anyway. That is the complicated truth of Daniel Boone. Most Americans have never heard the full version of this story. They know the myth. They know the coonskin cap that he never actually wore. They do not know about the 4 months he spent living among the Shawnee. They do not know about the 2 days of negotiation in open ground. They do not know that 60 people held off 400 for 11 days without losing a single life inside those walls. Now you know. And here is what I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below right now. Tell me, do you think Boone made the right call staying in Kentucky? Was it worth everything it cost? Was the survival of Boonesborough worth the consequences it set in motion for the tribes who called that land home? There is no easy answer to that question, and I genuinely want to know where you land on it. And if you want more real American history, not the Hollywood version, not the mythology, hit that subscribe button. Because there is a lot more where this came from. Thank you for watching the real story of Daniel Boone, not the legend, not the Hollywood version, not the guy in the coonskin cap. The real man. The one who lost his son and kept going. The one who lived among his enemy and walked back out to defend his people. The one who held 60 against 400 for 11 days in a wooden fort in the Kentucky wilderness. That man deserved a real telling. And you deserve to hear it. See you on the next one.